Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We are live on August 2nd, 2022. For those who are not so familiar with myself, I am Crystal Cedino, the Training and Development Manager at the Native Learning Center. Really thrilled that all of you could be here, all 22 of you. For those who came in early, thank you. For those who are arriving right on time, you've just made it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move forward and get through the Adobe Connect platform. All right, so for today's session, we're going to be discussing planning on applying for the Indian Community Development Block Grant. Here's what you need to know. It's day 2, also known as ICDBG, federal funds. So with that, let's go ahead and move forward. I'm just going to go ahead and read this quick disclaimer. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable, so please be mindful of that. And let's get into how to interact during today's presentation. So with that, you should see an icon at the top of your screen in the shape of a hand. And with that icon, you can either raise your hand, agree, disagree, or step away. Then there's other features such as applaud, laugh, so on and so forth. And there you go. I see somebody using the raise hand tool. So that feature is there to get our attention. And with that, I will say that typically we respond in the chat box, so keep an eye out on that. No one has microphone access, so chat box is how you will communicate throughout today's presentation. All right. Ooh, there we go. All right, so the image displayed here should look pretty similar to the layout of your screen. Again, just follow along. To the bottom left, you're going to find a box that says Files, and in there, you're going to find 3 things. So right now, you're going to find the day 1 of planning your ICDBG for 2022. We went ahead and provided that yesterday's session. And then you're also going to find today's session, Planning Your ICDBG 2022, day 2. All are in PDF format. And then you also have the NOFO in there, the Community Development Block Grant Program for Indian Tribes and Alaska Native Villages. In order to download it, all you're going to do is hover over that specific item, and you'll see an arrow button pointing downwards. Click that, and you should be able to save it to your computer, print it, use the material as you please. It is there for reference either throughout the webinar or afterwards, but we went ahead and provided it ahead of time so that y'all have it. And then if you have any other issues, like I see Brenda is coming in on her mobile device, but she's also on the web. So Brenda, if you have issues getting the material, let me know. I'm happy to email it to you. And the same goes for anyone else who is coming through the mobile app, because that is slightly different. All right, to the right of that is going to be a box that's titled Web Links. In there, you're going to find today's survey, which I will launch when the time comes. And then there's also the Adobe Connect desktop download. And with that, we really do encourage participants using the desktop. It's completely free. We don't get any kickbacks or anything like that from it. It is just there so that you have a better viewing and listening experience. We notice that those coming from the web browser typically experience more internet connectivity issues. So I definitely recommend downloading that, the app. And then what I've also included in there is the link for IHBG funding opportunity day 1 and 2. So keep in mind, all of these sessions are separate. You'll need to register for each of them. I already plugged them in the chat box. So if you're looking for, information on IHBG funds, definitely attend tomorrow and Thursday's session. And lastly, I went ahead and plugged in the recording for yesterday's session, ICDBG Funding Opportunity Day 1. Feel free to view that. If you missed yesterday's session, it is up and ready for viewing and listening. And you'll also actually be able to download all the materials. But all that information is there for you at any point. If you want to copy and save it onto your computer, just feel free to do so. That's what it's there for. All right, and then lastly, to the right of the screen, you're going to see your chat box, which is how you're going to communicate. As I mentioned, there is no microphone access for any of the participants. you can only communicate through the chat box. So if you do have questions, by all means, please insert them in the chat box. We're here to, make this webinar as interactive as possible. I know that reading NOFOs and so on and so forth isn't necessarily the most thrilling thing on the planet. However, it is important information. So, don't be shy. No question's a stupid question. Just type your message and hit enter, or click that up arrow key that's in the chat box to submit your response. And I will also be monitoring the chat box along with Brandy to make sure that we are answering everything. I do see that Gwen has mentioned something. That is perfectly okay, Gwen. I've got you. I'll go ahead and log those individuals as attended. But yes, that's basically it for me. Now, I believe, yep, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Brandy. She is your instructor. She was instructing yesterday's session as well. Go ahead, Brandy, introduce yourself and take it on over.
All right. Well, thank you, Crystal. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thumbs up. Okay, good. Perfect. I'm working at a library, so I'm trying not to be too loud. I don't need them to come shush me. But anyway, thank you guys all for joining us on day 2 this afternoon on the overview of the ICDBG funding opportunity for fiscal year 22. I appreciate all of you being here. I know we had a great turnout yesterday and got some good questions and things like that. And so, hopefully this will give you guys some more insight as to the last 3 rating factors of the application process, as well as give you guys an opportunity to ask additional questions along the way. The ICDBG program does provide eligible grantees with direct grants for use in developing our viable Indian and Alaskan Native communities. So it includes things such as decent housing, a suitable living environment, economic development opportunities, primarily for those low to moderate income individuals. We went in a little bit of detail about what classifies as LMI and where those ratios need to be for your projects. And so if you look back in yesterday's presentation there in the files, you'll have that information there. It's also listed in the NOFA. Over $72.1 million has been appropriated for fiscal year 22 for the single purpose and imminent threat grants. And so, like I said, today, we'll look at rating factors 3, 4, and 5 and get an understanding of, what is needed for developing your comprehensive project, as well as your leveraged funds and your coordination and comprehensiveness of your project. So for those of you that weren't here yesterday, just a little bit about myself. I am the owner of Hirota Bacache Consulting, and I provide tribal consulting services for tribes and tribal entities. I have over 13 years of experience and $40.7 million in grant awards working in Indian country, with a specific focus in Indian housing and NAHASDA, including the IHBG and ICDBG competitive grants. I do grant writing, grant management. I also do tribal human resources, training and technical assistance through Native Learning Center and Dobbins-Patterson Learning, and myself, policy development.
Sorry, Brandy, it looked like you dropped off.
There we go. Is it back?
Yeah, there we go.
It's storming here too, so sorry.
No worries.
And so I am a member of the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska and a descendant of the United Homa Nation, and I live here in New Orleans. I'll kind of skip through that. So just a little refresher of what the ICDBG program does. It is funded by the Department of HUD and provides eligible grantees with direct grants for developing Indian and Alaskan Native communities with safe and affordable housing. The ICDBG regulations can be found at 24 CFR Part 1003, and it is also authorized by Title I of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. So just a little refresher from yesterday so that you guys have an idea of what we're looking at for an overview of the ICDBG program. Again, as I mentioned, over $92.3 million is available for funding for this application round. The due date for the application is October 24th of 2022. We have a period of performance for 5 years with an estimated program start date of March of 2023 and an end date of March of 2028. The minimum grant award is $500,000 for all applicants. Maximum grant award ranges from $2 million to $5 million, depending on what area ONAP you live in. Leverage or cost sharing is not required, although as you will see when we look at rating factor 4, you do receive points depending on the amount of leverage you do put into your project. HUD does expect to make approximately 80 awards from these NOFO funds. And, you know, as Crystal mentioned, I do want you guys to take an opportunity as we go through these rating factors to ask any questions and things like that that you may have. That's what I'm here for. You know, and feel free to ask any like project specific questions or things like that. I'm more than happy to answer those for you all. Just another refresher from yesterday, as far as the rating factors go, a maximum of 100 points may be awarded under rating factors 1 through 5, with an additional 2 points available for promise zone activities. Note that they did remove opportunity zones as a preference point option in this fiscal year's program. So now the only opportunity we have are for those promise zone activities. To be even considered, for your application to even be considered, you must receive at least a minimum of 15 points under rating factor 1. So what that means is when you are completing rating factor 1 and it's scored by HUD, if you don't have at least 15 points, they will not look at your application any further. To be considered all across the board, after going through all your rating factors, your application must receive a minimum of 70 points without those extra preference points. I can tell you that most applications that are awarded typically range in that 90s range. I've seen a few that have been in the 80s, around 88, 89. So it really just depends on kind of where those factors fall. But I want you to keep that in mind. And just a little refresher on the 5 rating factors. Rating factor 1, capacity of the applicant. That is where you will describe your managerial and technical experience of your staff. And what I mean by staff is that internal staff working within your housing authority or housing department or tribe. If you do have any gaps in capacity, which a lot of tribes do end up having those gaps, when it comes to maybe finance department or development consultants or architects and engineers, you must actually provide a gap capacity assessment, and or if you don't have any gaps in capacity, you must have a statement in that section that says that you have no gaps in capacity. Also under rating factor 1, HUD will look at your audit submission requirements and ensure that your audits were, the last 2 audit periods were submitted timely or by the required deadline extension that you requested through HUD. Subfactor 1.3 will also look at your audit findings. HUD will actually use their available information to determine your score within this area. Subfactor 1.4, procurement and contract management, will look at your applicable requirements as they relate to 2 CFR Part 200 to the extent that it is incorporated into and made applicable by 24 CFR Part 1003, which are the ICDBG requirements. There were some recent amendments, so keep that in mind as you're developing your procurement section. For full points, HUD is requesting that you address each of the regulatory requirements and describe its implementation to your policies and procedures and that they're consistent with your applicable procurement requirements. They do not want you to simply refer to your procurement policies or to just provide a copy of that. They actually want you to provide an explanation of how you implement procurement through your processes. Subfactor 1.5 we'll look at disbursements as it relates to your ICDBG programs and the total amount still in locks. So there's some scoring mechanisms related to the amount of money ICDBG funds that are in your locks account. 1.6, we'll look at timely reporting. HUD will utilize their own information to score that area as far as making sure that all of your reports, such as SF 425s and ACERs, et cetera, were all submitted in a timely manner. 1.7 subfactor, we'll look at your closeouts. And again, this is another area where HUD will look at their own information and determine that your previous ICDBG projects were closed out within 90 days of the project being completed and the implementation schedule and things like that. And then the last subfactor under rating factor 1.8 are those monitoring findings, where HUD will actually evaluate your performance for resolved or unresolved any monitoring findings that you may or may not have under ONAP. Rating factor 2, as we talked about yesterday, looks at the need and extent of the problem. So here, just as a refresher, subfactor 2.1 will look at the need and viability of your project as a whole and of your community. First, you need to describe the need for your project. You also need to be able to demonstrate that the project will meet an essential community development need. And you also describe how and why the project will improve the viability of your community. Under subfactor 2.2, project benefit, this is where you will provide all of that statistical analysis and data that helps determine the percentage of LMI participants that will benefit from your project. There are a variety of different ways that you provide that data depending on the type of project you are doing. So pay close attention to that within the NOFO as you are determining what project activity area you're looking for and what required data HUD is requesting. Let's see, subfactor 2.3 is also another new subfactor as of last year, and its connection to tribal youth. So we must, in these applications, provide information as how this project is going to help prepare the youth to become contributing members of our community by increasing access to developmental programs. So, examples of youth-related projects that we've kind of seen coming out from last year's applications, these are going to be projects that house or provide dedicated space for youth, such as homeless shelters for families or counseling. Or you can incorporate youth into your actual design and construction portion of the project. So maybe utilizing them as training of youth for your actual trades, maybe coming in and doing an internship in the summertime and things like that. So that's where that part comes in. On 2.4, just as a refresher, we'll look at those are new and unfunded applicants. So that's just an automatic 5 points if you haven't been funded recently. And then 2.5, as we discussed yesterday, is that new area where there is a connection to climate change. And again, for that particular one, without going into all of the details, please go back to day one's slides. It provides a lot, or the NOFA, which starts on page 49, a lot of information regarding how you can incorporate either advanced carbon reduction or resilience projects into your application. And again, this isn't a preference point area. This is a requirement to your project. So, please make sure you're working with, the applicable either energy departments or architects and engineers to help make sure you put that information in there. And so we'll move forward now into ratings factors 3, 4, and 5 and give you guys some information on all of that. And see, I see Tiara's asking, some of these factors are not listed in the NOFO. For some reason, Tiara, I noticed that as well. Normally they put rating factor 1 and then they go into detail. For whatever reason, they just started making a running note of all the subfactors. So you have to pay close attention where it says subfactor 3.1. That's related to rating factor 3. If it says subfactor 2 point something, that's related to rating factor 2. I don't know why they left that out this year. I noticed the same thing. Michelle, yes, this was just a brief overview off of these slides here. And we're going into the more specific slides for rating factor 3.5. And then Sky is asking, what age does HUD count as youth? It used to be up to age 24. Let me double check here. Hold on one second. I don't think they updated that in the definitions this year. Youth is considered, by HUD's definition, a community member that has not reached the age of 24, and that can be found on page 12 of the NOFA. So that gives you a good opportunity, to work with those individuals, maybe students that have just, recently graduated and going to trade school and things like that, and giving them an opportunity to kind of do on-the-job learning. So looking at rating factor 3, here's where we will discuss our soundness of approach in developing our comprehensive project. Any questions so far on, what we looked at yesterday, or any kind of refresher questions that you guys may have on that? None yet? All right, well, we'll jump into this. So rating factor 3, soundness of approach, you are able to be awarded up to 29 points in this subfactor. Subfactor 3.1, description of rationale of the proposed project, you can get a combined total of 10 points for this subfactor. For this, you must be able to provide a detailed description of the rationale behind your project, including how you determine the project design and that the plans and design are feasible and cost effective. So in order to do that, there are a variety of bullet points that HUD wants to ensure that you are including in this area of your work plan narrative. 1, you need to describe the project in detail, including the size of the project. So that includes things such as square feet, linear feet, bedroom size, those sorts of things, types of bedroom, number of bedrooms, the type of project. So the type of building or the type of construction and material that you might be utilizing. They also want you to describe the location. So they want to see either a map or an address or an aerial photo of where you're going to be placing and or doing the project for these units. If available, HUD loves to see architectural renderings and floor plans of any projects that you're doing, whether it be a rehab or a new construction project. Providing that information really gives them an opportunity to see that you have put some, early skin in the game on the preliminary side, and working maybe with an architect and engineering team to have some of that scope already laid out, and kind of showing that you're shovel ready. You must also describe how the project is feasible and cost effective. What is your area of ensuring that you are not going, over TDC limits, that these costs are reasonable for the area that you live in, and that it's a feasible opportunity for your community. Next, you must also explain your rationale behind the project design. So this is going to focus on, your specific project. So for example, if you're utilizing maybe some new construction under your ICDBG, and it's for elders, and so you want to make everything ADA accessible, maybe you want to put some ramps in and things like that, you need to describe that, this is going to be an elder community, you want to be able to provide, efficiency for those elders to be able to get in and out easy, things like that. And then that the costs, that are being determined are, again, cost effective. And then again, you also need to describe the rationale behind that project design. So not just the feasibility, but that rationale. Once you've done that, they also take that a step further and want you to explain the rationale for the project design. For example, things where it includes health and safety, climate resilience, and all of that. Beverly, I just saw your question pop up, and I am wondering the same things. For whatever reason, last year and in previous years, usually they had those all lumped together. I'm not quite sure what they mean by the difference between rationale behind and the rationale before. To me, I know when I've written these applications, typically that second bullet point there, as far as, talking about example of health and safety and or climate resilience, fell into the bullet point above that. So I'm not quite sure why they separated that out, other than the fact that climate resilience is now part of this, and they want to ensure that you're explaining that in the design and, the architectural design of your project there. You must also describe how you're going to comply with Indian preference requirements. And so, in the procurement section, you talk, on subfactor 1.3, you're talking about Indian preference requirements under procurement. In this project, in this area, you actually need to decide how you're going to comply with those requirements, as far as hiring, ensuring that contractors are, giving Indian preference, maybe that any staff that you may be hiring to help work through the project, you're giving Indian preference requirements and those sorts of things. Now, if you're doing housing construction, rehab, or public facility building projects, you must describe and provide the cost savings in percentage or dollar amount resulting from either the building design or construction methods or energy efficiency measures that will be realized in future years. So this is an opportunity to describe, for example, if you're doing a rehab project of multiple units, maybe you're ensuring that you put, you're providing all of you're purchasing, for example, you're doing bathrooms, all of the toilets at once. Obviously you're going to get a discount ordering in bulk rate. Or perhaps, there's some energy efficiency measures and you've talked with, maybe your local utility company, or maybe you've had some kind of energy assessment done and they've explained, hey, if you change out these windows and provide certain weatherization techniques, or new HVAC units, here's the dollar amount you could potentially save, in the long term. If you are doing a project that is just an acquisition of land for future housing, you must also explain that there is a reasonable ratio between the number of usable acres to be acquired and the number of LMI households to benefit from the project. So what they're asking here is if you are purchasing 10 acres of land and you want to build 50 houses, obviously there's probably going to be a hard sell that there's a reasonable ratio of 50 houses on 10 acres. Unless maybe you're doing tiny homes, which is kind of a dream of mine too. But, you want to make sure, that you have that assessment, like from an architect and engineering team that can help ensure that you have, enough land to put the number of houses and units on there that you want, of the people you want to serve. Any questions on that, describing the project? Nothing yet? All right. Well, we'll kind of jump into the budget side of things. So subfactor 3.2, we'll look at your budget narrative. You must submit the cost summary, which is your HUD 4123 form, which we'll look at here in a few minutes, and a detailed budget narrative that is separate from your work plan narrative for the proposed project and activities. HUD is going to evaluate whether your budget is thoroughly prepared, that it's mathematically correct, which means that your budget within your budget narrative and your cost summary and any of the dollar amount that's in the attachments you provide all match up. And they will look at that. And that all costs, including your leveraging, are eligible costs under the ICDBG. And that they are allowable, allocable, reasonable, and necessary for implementing the proposed project activities. Again, just as a reminder, the budget on the SF 424, your cost summary, your budget narrative, and any supporting documentation have to be consistent. I have seen those applications, be scored with less points in the budget because one number was off and things like that. If your application does include a public service component, like we talked about yesterday, as far as maybe you're doing, down payment assistance and setting aside 15% for something like that, your budget also must include a breakdown of those costs within that budget plan. For planning and administrative costs, you do not include direct project costs or activity delivery cost. So for example, those certain architectural, engineering, and environmental and technical assistants, or even your staff and overhead that are related to directly carrying out those eligible activities. But you will include any funds the applicant will contribute towards administering the grant. So this is going to be things such as either your IDC, maybe the cost of your doing an audit, on this grant activity over the next 5 years. It could include the cost of hiring a grant writer to write this application for you. All of those things would go into your planning and admin side of things. Indirect cost, if you do utilize those as a tribe, they will count towards the administration and planning cap. If you are not requesting ICDBG funds to administer the project, you need to specify who will pay for this. And then finally, you also have to describe the qualifications and experience of the individuals that prepared the budget and how their experience is also recent within the last 5 years and relevant to the proposed activities. So if you remember back when we were looking at subfactor 1.1 yesterday, and describing our capacity of our applicants and our internal staff or our consultants that we bring in, here's where you're going to reiterate that finance person or that fee accountant or whomever you've worked with to hire to help determine that these costs, within the budget fit the needs and fill in that capacity, for your organization. So this is an example of what the cost summary, the 4123, looks like for HUD. I know it's kind of hard to see. Crystal, is there a way to make this a little bigger?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay. It seemed like the slides were bigger yesterday.
Sorry, I don't know. Yeah, no, there's no way to zoom in, unfortunately.
Okay, that's fine. So the cost summary form is just the HUD 4123. So keep that in mind that this cost summary form will be different than the cost summary form we'll look at on Thursday with the IHBG competitive. And it provides that detailed breakdown of your costs that must match your budget and your SF 424 and any supporting documentation. If you look at the top right up here, you'll put in the type, your project name. You'll, mention that this is an original application. And then here's where you'll list your project name and project category. So if you're doing, for example, a rehab activity, you'll put rehabilitation activities, maybe scattered sites around the New Orleans metro area. I'm just throwing something out there. On this next column is your planned ICDBG expenditure. So this is how much of your ICDBG funds will go in there. Your next column will be where you put your leveraged funds. And then any non-federal funds that you may tap into, and then you'll explain over here what those funds are that you may be tapping into with other funds or non-federal funds. As you go through it, at the bottom, there's some administrative components there where you put in your planning and admin, breaking out, the cost of audits and those sorts of things as well. All of this should total up. I will say I have seen issues in the past where this form doesn't work appropriately depending on the either version of Adobe that you're using or the way it was downloaded or things like that. So make sure you work on this form early enough so that you do have an opportunity to reach out to HUD if it isn't calculating or working through things, for you the correct way, that HUD can help get you, the correct form. Any questions? No? No one? All right. Well, we'll move past this. The next subfactor that we'll look at is subfactor 3.3, which is your project implementation schedule. Here you can get a maximum of 4 points. And these points are assigned based on the level of detail provided in your implementation schedule or your HUD form 4125, which we'll look at here in a few minutes as well, and or your project implementation narrative. So not only do you need to explain your implementation schedule in your work plan narrative, you must also provide the Form 4125. Now, this implementation schedule will include a breakdown of tasks that are needed to complete your project. I can tell you, depending on your HUD region, really depends on how they will accept and how much information they really want in these implementation schedules. I can tell you that in the past, I have, one region or a couple of regions that I work with where obviously for 5 years, these implementation schedules only, show 2 fiscal years on it. I have some clients that actually develop an implementation schedule on an Excel spreadsheet and then just put a note in the actual HUD form that says, see attached implementation schedule. And it's perfectly fine for some of those regions. I have other regions that do not like that, and they actually make us go and do multiple page 4125s and expand that out. So you end up having, a 3 to 4 page 4125. And then keep in mind that as you're adding in the drawdowns and things like that, the calculations don't always add up. And so you need to pay special attention to that. Again, just make sure, HUD, has given you information on how best to complete that implementation schedule before you submit it. This is what that implementation schedule looks like, just to give you an idea. At the top, again, this is the 4125. You'll put your name of your applicant. HUD will assign the grant number whenever they go through that process. This will be an original submission to HUD, and you'll put in the date that you're submitting your application here. On line 4 is where you will actually put the name of your project. 5 will be the effective date, so that first date of your period of performance. The expected end date would be that last day that you expect that project to be completed, whether it's the end date that HUD has given within that period of performance, or whether you have a different end date because maybe you're not taking the entire 5 years. And then your expected closeout date should always be 90 days following the completion of the project. Here is where you will actually give an example or provide information on what your environmental review status is. If you're not sure yet, there is an option to pick not started and review has not yet begun. Maybe you have already started this process and choose the applicable category to select there. On section 7, that is where you put your actual fiscal year for your program. So it does say tribal fiscal year. That could be different from your TDHE. So make sure you're putting whoever the applicant is, whether it's the tribe or the TDHE's actual fiscal year here. And then here's where you'll fill in all of the tasks and actually just make hash marks across your periods of performance. This last column, if some of these activities actually roll over into another fiscal year, you'll kind of put those end dates there and then continue on that on separate pages. And I know it's hard to see here. The bottom is where you actually do your planned drawdowns by quarter and your cumulative drawdowns to give you an idea of where that information, what those dollar amounts are. HUD completely understands that you may not have those specific drawdowns laid out just yet. And so it's okay to provide an estimate, because what will happen is when HUD does award your grant award, they will ask you typically for an updated implementation schedule. I mean, I think we've all learned over the last couple of years that although HUD has a set period of performance date that starts, I think this year we were about 2 or 3 months behind on those grant awards. And so we all had to go in and update these implementation schedules. So, just keep that in mind. Let's see. So Michelle's saying, I noticed in the past there are all kinds of different 4125s, and not just this one, but the others with different dates. The latest forms HUD will put those on Code Talk. And at some point they'll be updated into the grants.gov side of things also, Michelle. And so, making sure you're using the more recent forms and all of that. When I looked this morning, they did not have all of the forms in the zip file that I could tell, but they should be updating those here, pretty soon. And again, if you look here, yes, this shows an expiration of 2018, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's expired. They may not have updated it at all since then. And so, they will usually send out a letter or notice that says that all of these have been updated. And then this is just another example of that Excel sheet implementation schedule attachment that I've worked with before in the past too, because there you can actually kind of see all of the fiscal years laid out over, a 5-year period versus, 2 years on the previous one and then 2 years on another one and so on and so forth. But again, please talk to your HUD representative and ask them, for what regions, things need to be a certain way. I can tell you Southern Plains ONAP usually makes me go back and even if I provide this one, fill it in on the actual form. Other regions have not been so hard on that requirement. So just keep that in mind as well. Any questions on project implementation or how to determine any of that and how to lay that out? No questions so far? All right. So under the next subfactor 3.4, that is our commitment to sustain activities. So within this area, your application shows that you will be able to sustain your project once it is complete. And how you do that will depend on the type of project you are applying for. So obviously there are 5 different project types that you can apply for in here, and each one of these will require different things. And so we'll kind of go through that here in just a second. If you're doing a public facilities and infrastructure project, you must state that the tribe or another entity has adopted an operations and maintenance plan, or otherwise known as an O&M plan, to maintain the project, and that it commits by resolution or a commitment letter that the funds to do so, that they have the funds to do so, and what that dollar amount is. An O&M plan should also include the operating cost breakdown for the annual expenses and indicate a time frame for maintaining and operating the project that is not less than 5 years following the grant closeout date. So you need to be able to show that you can sustain this project for 5 more years after you close out this funding. The following components must be addressed in an O&M plan. 1, any daily or other periodic maintenance activities, how you're going to handle repairs, such as replacing broken windows. You need to describe any capital improvements or, where replacement reserves are going to come from for any repairs or things such as, replacing a roof or major activities like that. You must describe that you have and will maintain fire and liability insurance. Obviously, this does not apply to infrastructure projects such as water and sewer lines, but if you're doing a public facility like a community building or something like that, you obviously need to have that. And then any security that you may need to have. Maybe you do have leverage with your police department to ensure that someone's providing security to make sure, that building, stays safe, people aren't breaking in or destroying it or things like that. Under economic development projects, you must provide an analysis which shows the public benefit will result from the assisted project that is commensurate with the ICDBG assistance requested. So what you need to do is provide an analysis that establishes the following line items. One, that there's reasonable financial support that is committed from non-federal sources prior to the disbursement of federal funds. That any grant amount provided will not substantially reduce the amount of non-federal financial support for the activity. That not more than a reasonable rate of return on investment is provided to the owner, and grant funds used for the project will be dispersed on a pro rata basis with amounts from other sources. In addition, it must be established that the project is financially feasible and that it has a reasonable chance for success. So you do need to have some kind of feasibility study done and things like that before you just, take on a economic development project. And then finally, this analysis has to be prepared by a qualified party or firm that has that recent and relevant experience in the type of project being proposed. So again, this is where you're going to probably have a capacity gap and need to bring in an outside consultant to kind of help determine and analyze, these particular factors. If you are doing new housing construction, housing rehab, housing acquisition, and homeownership assistance projects, you must describe in detail how your project will be sustained by addressing maintenance and insurance responsibilities. And this needs to be, described in detail and also state who's paying for that. So, if this is something under you as a TDHE or housing department, go ahead and describe your rehab policies and or your maintenance and insurance responsibilities as they may be outlined in your lease agreements or things like that. And if, there's, also processes as far as, damage, by the tenant, if that they're paying for certain things, if it's damage, just normal wear and tear, that the housing authority, may cover that, really explaining out how the maintenance procedures of these projects are going to be carried out. For those of you that may be doing a micro enterprise program, persons that are determined to be low to moderate income may qualify for a micro enterprise program designed to provide job training and placement or other employment support services, such as peer support programs, counseling, childcare, transportation, those types of similar services. Your application needs to describe the micro enterprise program, including the type of assistance offered to micro enterprise applicants and the types of entities eligible to apply for the assistance. You must also explain how you will analyze those micro enterprise applications, business plans, market studies, and feasibility studies. If you're doing a credit program, you need to describe how you would determine the loan terms, such as interest rate, maximum loan amounts, etc., that you will offer to those individual micro enterprise applicants. And then last, is that the last one? Remember, I have one more. Yeah, that's the last one. Subfactor 3.4E, if you're doing new land acquisition projects to support new housing, your application needs to show the results of preliminary investigations conducted by a qualified independent entity that demonstrates the proposed site has suitable soil conditions for housing and infrastructure, potable water accessible for a reasonable cost, and access to utilities, vehicular access, drainage, nearby and social community services, no known environmental problems. And additionally, you must submit documentation to indicate that all units will be constructed within 2 years after you purchase the site, and that addressing in your work plan narrative whether your implementation schedule has this information, and you must include evidence such as a construction contract agreement. Can you hear me better now, Gail? My AirPod was starting to fall out, so I'm not sure if that was part of the reason why audio was cutting out. Perfect. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So I'm curious, just to kind of give you guys, get some input from you all. Do you guys have an idea of the types of projects you guys will be applying for under the ICDBG program? So rehab, we got some new construction. Tiara, are you guys a CBDO in order to do those new construction activities? Or have a CBDO you'll be working with? Ah, perfect. All right, all right. No, no, totally agree, Sky, and definitely have to kind of really look at some of the eligible activities and stuff with doing a mini strip mall with the ICDBG, making sure that, all of the components of it can, really fit into the scope of eligible activities for sure. Especially, I mean, definitely maybe new construction as an economic development program for sure. Infrastructure for housing development. Perfect. Great. Well, good. You guys all have some various different activities you guys are doing. Gail, it's okay if you guys don't know yet. A lot of these are a little, sometimes difficult to decide what's the best route to go, and all that. Just keep in mind we've got a couple of months out and on putting these applications together. All right. Well, we're going to jump into rating factor 4, leveraging your resources. I know this one, we often get some confusion as far as all of this, how we leverage, how we determine our leverage amounts that we need to put in there, what qualifies as leverage. And so, I want to spend a little time talking about that with all of you. Under rating factor 4, there is cost sharing or mandatory matching is not required, but voluntarily leveraging both federal and non-federal funds is encouraged because you do receive extra points. Applicants that are proposing leveraging must identify the source and specific amounts in its work plan narrative and include reference to that firm commitment documentation submitted with the application. So what is considered firm commitment? It must be submitted for any sources of leveraging, including cash or in-kind contributions that could, making sure, that there's a dollar amount attached to that. Contributions that could be considered as leverage. Resources for points awarded include, but are not limited to, the following. Things such as tribal government funds, loans from individuals or organizations, private foundations, businesses, and state or federal loans like an IHBG Title VI or other those types of guarantees. Other federal grants permitted by the statute, including any IHBG funds. Any donated goods and services that are needed for the project. That's a good way to not have to put your own cost in there. Keeping in mind that this year for 25% of leverage for a project is approximately $670,000. So keeping that in mind as you're kind of thinking about your projects, because they increase that, and those are for those that qualify for 2 million. Fortunately haven't done the leverage for 5 million yet for all of that. I think actually for 5 million it would be 1.666667. 4.3, I'd have to look at that, but that gives you an idea of like where you need to, come up with your leveraged resources. Land that is needed for the project can be used as leverage, and this can include land that was purchased prior to the application deadline date. But you cannot have utilized land that has already been allocated as leverage to another project. If you're using the land used for a building expansion project, if the land was not previously used for leverage, and direct administrative costs but only up to 20% cap allowed for admin cost. So what does land leverage resources not include? Indirect administrative costs as identified in 2 CFR Part 200. Administrative costs that exceed the regulatory limit of 20% of the ICDBG grant award. Any ineligible ICDBG expenditures, such as a contribution of funds to pay for anticipated operations and maintenance, or the value of an existing facility if your application is to expand or rehab an existing facility. So keep those in mind as well as you're really laying out into helping to determine, what your leverage needs to be. With the exception of the value of land acquisition and proposal cost, funds that have been expended on the project prior to the period of performance start date will not be counted as leverage. Applicants are not allowed to spend leverage dollars before the approval of the request for release of funds, with the exception of the acceptable pre-award leveraging, which is that value of land acquisition or the proposal cost. So until you get your release of funds following the environmental review process, you cannot touch your leverage either. Additional leveraged resources must be for the same project that is proposed and incurred within the time frame of the period of performance of the proposed project. Applicants are definitely reminded that all ICDBG requirements to the commitment or use of both ICDBG and non-IHBG funds in a leveraged project. Federal sources are only allowed to be used as leverage if it's permitted by a program's authorizing statute. So please, please, please keep that part in mind. I've seen some applications come through where some people have tried to use IHS funds. IHS doesn't allow leveraging with certain areas of our HUD funding, and so please keep that in mind. Usually IHS is pretty good, when you start telling them what a project is, oh no, we can't help you with that. But, not everybody may not necessarily be aware of that. So, keep that in mind too, that you are validating and verifying that those federal sources can be used as leverage towards another program. So here's just some examples of the evidence and documentation needed depending on the type of leverage that you are utilizing. If you're using tribal resources, you need to have a tribal resolution that is committing the funds or an equivalent. It must identify the exact dollar amount. If you're using in-kind funds, a method of valuation detailing the dollars used must be included. If you decide to use federal funds, like your IHBG formula funds, whether they're administered by the tribe or a TDHE, you need to have the most recently approved IHP identify the dollar amount and commit the IHBG resources to the project. If you're currently approved, if not currently approved in the most recent IHP, you must state that amendment to the IHP will be processed if you are awarded those ICDBG funds. And so, oftentimes, our ICDBGs, were due here in July for some tribes. Obviously, ICDBG just came out a week ago, so you may not have included that. And now you're deciding to apply, and so you just need to put a statement in there that you anticipate amending that IHP if you are awarded the project. Let's see. Other federal program funds that include funds from maybe USDA. Again, like I said, there's some IHS funds that allow it, some that don't, BIA or other federal agencies. If you are using other federal funds, the applicant needs to submit a statement, a letter, an email, or something from that federal agency approving the amount of funds to be committed for leverage. If you're leveraging things from another tribal organization, you need to have a statement of committing and identifying the amount of funds to be committed for leverage. So for example, if you're TDHE and you're committing your own IHBG leverage, you have a letter or a resolution from your Board of Commissioners that, states that this is how much we're going to be committing. Some of you guys may work with either public agencies, foundations, or other private parties. And so you need to have letters of commitment that include, the organizational name, any of the funds that are being proposed, the dollar amount of the financial or in-kind resource, how they determine the value of that, and an official of the organization that is legally authorized to make these commitments. You may utilize an MOU or an MOA to participate, including any conditions to which contribution may be subject to. So keeping that in mind also. Maybe you're utilizing goods and services, and you have to demonstrate that the donated items are necessarily to the actual development of the project and include comparable costs that support the donation. And then if you're utilizing land that has not been utilized before, you must establish a land valuation and the methods used to determine that land value and identify it. Those things include things such as a site-specific appraisal, no more than 2 years old, an appraisal, which includes tax assessments of a nearby comparable site, also no more than 2 years old, a reasonable extrapolation of land value based on current area realtor value guides, or a reasonable extrapolation of land value based on recent sales of similar properties in the same area. So for those of you that do decide to utilize land, make sure you have those appraisals in there. That's, something HUD will look at and look for. Applicants are reminded that environmental review requirements under 24 CFR Part 58 do apply to the commitment or use of both the ICDBG and non-ICDBG funds in a leveraged project. HUD also recognizes that in some cases, you may not get a firm commitment of non-tribal funds by a deadline. If that is the case, you do need to include a statement from the contributing entity that describes why the firm commitment cannot be made. The statement must also say that your tribe and organization and proposed project meets the eligible criteria for receiving the leveraged funds. And it must also include a date by which funding decisions will be made. And so perhaps, you're going to leverage your ICDBG and your IHBG together, and obviously the IHBG is not due until after this. And so there's going to be a lapse in grant awards and things like that. And so, obviously those things are all taken into consideration. And those are things where you would describe, why you don't have that firm commitment yet. Keep in mind that HUD will re-rate and re-rank any application with the updated leverage information. If you do not provide HUD with evidence of that firm commitment from the original leverage source or an alternative source within 6 months of the date of grant approval, or if the anticipated leverage is not provided. So you do have a risk of losing funds if you can't provide that information within 6 months. HUD will rescind the grant and recapture grant funds if your application no longer meets the threshold point requirements after re-rating and re-ranking. And HUD does reserve the right to terminate the grant for cause and recapture any grant funds. So what does scoring look like? If you provide 25% or more of a firm commitment documentation for leverage, you will receive the maximum of 6 points. Anything between 18 and 24 is 5 points, 11 to 17 is 4, 4 to 10 is 2, and 3 or less is 0. And I'll give you guys an example of how we determine and calculate those leveraged funds. Leveraged funds are calculated by dividing the total eligible leveraged resources by the total project cost as defined on line 18G of the SF 424. So the example of this is the percentage of leverage equals the total leveraged resource amount. So all the areas of leverage that you're providing, that total amount there, divided by the total project cost. So how do you determine what your total project cost is? That is going to be the ICDBG grant amount requested. So in this case, $2 million, and the total leveraged resource amount. So $670,000 if you're going for 20%, 25%. So your total project cost would be $2,670,000 divided by that $267,000 would give you your leveraged amount. And so just to give you, here's an example here of how that breaks down with, actual numbers. Any questions on that? I know leverage gets to be kind of tricky when we're sitting down and figuring those out. No one? All right. Well, we're going to move on to the next one then. This is your opportunity to ask as many questions as you'd like. So rating factor 5, we'll look at comprehensiveness and coordination activities. Under coordination, under this, up to 6 points can be awarded. Under coordination, you will receive up to 2 points, and they will be assigned as follows. You need to note that If a grant is awarded to an applicant and it is not clear whether their citizen participation requirements were met, the grantee will have to show citizen participation compliance at pre-award. So what this means is, it is a best practice, in my opinion, that sometime between now and early October, when it's time to submit your application, that you hold a community meeting where you go through what you're looking to do for this particular grant and explain that to community and, fulfill those citizen participation requirements. I like those being done. A lot of times I will host those with my tribal clients where we sit down and we go through what we're looking at for the IHP. We're looking at all the various projects we have going on and programs. And then we also look at all of the different grants that are out there that we are applying for and how we can, put those towards our upcoming projects. And so that's a good way to do a citizen participation meeting. You invite tribal council, your board, any of your tribal citizens to really provide that input. And keep in mind that just because they give input doesn't mean that those are activities you have to do. Oftentimes you may get something completely extraordinary that just doesn't even fit in the scope of the project and isn't reasonable. And obviously, until you start really working in housing and understand the NAHASDA, those things are going to happen. But this will give you an idea of what needs to be done. Tiara, this is on page 63 of the NOFO. And so when you're doing this section, you need to demonstrate that the activities are consistent with a strategic plan or policy goals of your community. So, your strategic plan could potentially just be your IHP. Although I always suggest doing long-term strategic planning. I know some of you guys may not have the capacity to do that annually. It is a good practice. It helps you lay out, not just your IHP, but long-term goals, especially when you're doing like long-term rehab or new construction projects. You also need to identify and describe how you plan to coordinate and work on the project with organizations that will not be providing leveraged funds to the project. So, maybe, describing how you work with, other tribal departments or the tribe as a whole. And although they're not providing leveraged funds, you coordinate activities, along the way, maybe with social services or things like that. And then you also need to summarize how you involve the community in developing the application pursuant to those citizen participation requirements. So again, describing, that you held these citizen participation meetings, what you went through to do those, what kind of input you received, and all of that. I can go back to that, Michelle. I actually have a handy dandy Excel spreadsheet that automatically calculates the leverage. So before I had that handy dandy spreadsheet, I literally sat there and I just played on my phone with calculations and numbers until I got to that 25%. I can share that with you guys. What I can do is have Crystal, I could send that to her, and then she has all your guys' registration emails. I can have her send that out to you guys. And in there, you can input numbers and all of that. It's a very calculated, Excel spreadsheet where you can change numbers and all of that. So outputs and outcomes as subfactor 5.2. Here you'll be able to receive up to 4 points. In this portion of your application, you must include outcomes and outputs that you hope to achieve with your project. So outputs are measured in the volume of work accomplished. They should be clear enough to allow HUD to monitor and assess the proposed project progress if funded. An outcome is the impact you hope to achieve with your proposed project. And these should be quantifiable measures or indicators that identify the change in the community, people's lives, or economic status. So I'll give you guys some examples of outputs and outcomes. So depending on the type of project proposed, Output examples can include, but are not limited to, the number of housing units rehabbed or constructed, the number of jobs created, the number of community facilities built, the number of education or job training opportunities provided, the number of tribal youth participants, the linear feet of infrastructure. As you can see, these are all quantifiable numbers, hard numbers that you'll put in there. Depending on the type of project proposed, outcomes would include things such as, reduction in the number of families living in substandard housing, or, reduction in overcrowding, an increase in home ownership rates, increase in units connected to gas, phone, or electrical lines. All of these are more explanatory outcomes that you hope to achieve from your actual outputs. Does that make sense to everyone? Perfect, good deal. As I mentioned, HUD did remove the opportunity zone. So now the only preference points that you could potentially get with this application is 2 points for activities in promise zones. If you are looking to receive promise zone preference points, you must submit a form 50153, certification of consistency with promise zone goals and implementation, signed by a promise zone official authorized to certify that the project meets that criteria. So what do we do when our application's done? We've got it all together. We think we got a good solid application and project in place. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to want to conduct an internal review of the application prior to submission. How do you do that? First, establish a review team. If you're using an outside grant writer, typically bring in maybe your executive director and maybe, the departmental directors from the various departments that may actually touch this project, even some outside consultants or editors, even your grant writer, and go through that application. I could say my best practices, usually what I do is I send it out, everybody kind of looks at it, and then I usually hold a Zoom meeting with everyone and I pull it up, and a lot of times, changes are very minimal. And so we'll just sit there, on an hour-long Zoom call and make those changes and updates together. And then we'll send it out for one more final review. You definitely want to utilize that NOFA checklist for your review process. So you want to go through all of those areas in the NOFA, not just the scoring sheet, to make sure all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And then you want to self-score the rating factors. You want to go through each of those rating factors and determine that you have hit all of the bullet points in the maximum scoring sections that HUD has asked you to provide information for. Self-scoring your application is a good way to give you an idea of where you are in the process. And definitely be conservative as far as doing that as well. Don't just give yourself full max points and 8 when you don't even have a finance director on staff right now. That might be a capacity gap that you need to explain. Or if you know your audits are late, obviously do not give yourself the full 2 points. You're going to want to look at how HUD scores that and give yourself an idea. Keeping in mind that most applications that are awarded are anywhere between 88 and 100%. Any questions or input on reviewing your application? All right, well, just to give you a little bit more tidbit on, how HUD will review and select this process. Under past performance, when HUD evaluates the application, they will consider your past performance in managing funds. And so items HUD will consider include things such as the ability to account for funds in compliance with applicable reporting and record keeping requirements, which is why, they point those things out in subfactor or rating factor 1. The timely use of funds received from HUD, timely submission of reports, meeting program requirements, meeting performance targets, your organizational capacity, including your staffing structures and capabilities, your timely completion of activities and receipt of expenditure or promised matching and leveraged funds, and the number of persons targeted for assistance. HUD may reduce scores based on the past performance review as specified under your review criteria. Wherever possible, HUD will obtain that past performance information themselves, as it's mentioned here in the NOFO. When they're trying to assess their applicant risk, which means, HUD doesn't want to give money out to someone that hasn't properly accounted for their funds through their financial management system for years. This are going to, communities that have sound financial management practices in place. And so they're going to look at things such as financial stability, the quality of your management systems, and the ability to meet the management standards. Your history of performance, they're going to look at your reports and audit findings, and again, your ability to implement statutory, regulatory, and other requirements. So you've passed all that point. You've passed those threshold requirements that HUD looks at and all of those things. And now they're going to determine, your actual selection process. Your area ONAP is who is in charge of screening and accepting applicants if they meet all of the criteria below. One, that the application is received and submitted in accordance with the requirements of the NOFO, that you're an eligible applicant to submit the application, that the project is an eligible activity, and that your application contains all the applicable components listed in Section 4B of the NOFO, that you show at least 70% of the grant funds are to be used for LMI persons. For screening purposes, HUD will use the census data posted at the fiscal year 22 data update for LMI area benefit designations for the HUD ICDBG if data submitted with the application does not meet the screening requirements. They're also going to look at the threshold compliance and ensure that you pass the screening process there. They're going to look at your past performance of past ICDBG applications. They're going to review and rate each project as it's laid out in the rating factors and those scorings. And again, determine if you have the minimum points applicable to be scored under rating factor 1, and then moving forward, an overall score of 70 points. I know this one might be a little hard to see. All projects will be ranked against each other according to the point totals they receive, regardless of the type of project or component under which the points were awarded. Projects will be selected for funding based on the final ranking to the extent that the funds are available. ONAP will determine individual grant amounts in a manner consistent with the regulations, the considerations in 24 CFR 1003. They may approve a grant amount less than the amount requested. And in doing so, they may consider the size of the applicant, the level of demand, etc., when doing that. If the area ONAP determines that there are not enough funds available to fund a project as proposed by the applicant, it may decline to fund that project and may fund the next highest level ranking project or projects. In such cases, the area ONAP will select in rank order additional projects for funding. And I see Gail's asking, does HUD still publish the general regulations annually? I could not. Gail, I don't know that I have seen those published since before COVID. I don't know if they've kind of just combined these all together or what, but now that you've mentioned that, I have not seen them out there in quite some time. So in my opinion, knowing how HUD works, that would mean the most recent, the last ones that were published are what they're going by until they, amend and change that the next round at some point, I should say. There may be tiebreakers in this situation. I have seen this happening over the these last funding rounds. When rating results in a tie among projects, there is not enough money to fund, and there's not enough money to fund all tied projects. They will use the following factors to resolve the tie. HUD will approve projects that can be fully funded over those that cannot be. If an applicant received a higher score on the youth subfactor, another tiebreaker will be an applicant with the fewest active ICDBGs, and the last would be a project that benefits the highest percentage of LMI persons. So they've got some odd nuances here on how they're going to break these ties. So keep that in mind as well. If there's technical deficiencies in successful applications, HUD will request that you address those deficiencies by an established timeline. Again, there's pre-award requirements. You need to provide that supporting documentation. And then HUD will notify the applicants by email, and the applicant will be provided 14 calendar days to respond to those requirements. Here's an email address for the actual ICDBG if you need assistance in understanding the NOFA. Keep in mind that HUD staff cannot assist applicants in preparing the application. So between now with my training here and when HUD holds their NOFO training, those will be your only opportunities to kind of ask vaguely specific, project-specific questions directly to HUD. Otherwise, you may need to come to me or someone else to ask those particular questions. But HUD will not assist. Basically, they'll say, "Look at the NOFA." So keep that in mind as well. And then finally, make sure you're submitting your application to grants.gov within the time frame allotted. Give yourself at least 24 or 48 hours prior to the deadline in case of technical difficulty. Trust me, it is not fun to be up to the wire. HUD will announce probably through a Dear Tribal Leader letter or something through CoTalk when they will host their webinar training date. And then always feel free to contact your area EWONAP office for any questions that you may have. And remember, your deadline for this one is October 24th, 2022 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through grants.gov. So I will give you guys an opportunity to ask any questions or anything like that that you may have. We've got about 8 minutes or so left. And then at the same time, I'm going to go ahead and put up my contact information for all of you, for those of you that may want to reach out. And I'll also type it here in the chat box in case any of you guys have any direct questions or anything like that for me. Well, as some of you guys are typing out questions and comments, thank you guys all for being here. Like I said, my contact information is there if you need assistance in developing applications or just have questions that you need to ask. Feel free to reach out, and best of luck on your application process.
Thank you, Brandy. Definitely appreciate you doing today's webinar and yesterday's.
Most welcome.
All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and launch the survey. So please take a second to complete that. It only helps us to make these sessions better. So please be honest and aware, actually, that they're anonymous. So we have no idea who fills them out. We just want to make these sessions even better. Okay. I'll go ahead and continue closing out today's session. Join us tomorrow, August 3rd, 2022, for the IHBG Funding Opportunity Day 1. That's the Indian Housing Block Grant. That'll be 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, and 11 a.m. Pacific. And as always, registration is free. And again, the presenter for tomorrow is going to be Brandy Liberty, Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, tribal consultant and owner of Herodo Bacache Consulting. So join us if you're wondering information regarding that grant. Great. And then feel free to access this and other recorded webinars anytime on our website, www.nativelearningcenter.com. We keep them up for about 18 months, so feel free to view them and share them with your friends and colleagues. Or if there are webinars where you're looking for something that's maybe been expired, let me know, and I will go ahead and see if I can put it up for y'all. I'll plug my email in. How do I register for tomorrow's webinar? I'm so glad you asked, Gail, because I went ahead and plugged it in the chat box, and it's in the web links box. So for day 1 and 2, go ahead and plug that in again. There you go. First one's day 1, second one's day 2. You have to register for each session. All right. And then don't forget to check out our upcoming events as well on our social media sites such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Snapchat. And don't forget that we have a podcast, The Hobo Thing, a podcast, which you can find on simplecast.com, as well as Apple, Spotify, Google. Just want to say thank you, each and every one of you, for taking the time out of your busy work schedules. I totally understand. We at the Native Learning Center are very busy as well. So thank you, thank you. I hope each and every single one of you have a wonderful day, and I hope to connect with y'all real soon. So until tomorrow or the next webinar, I'll see you then. So for now, bye.
Thanks, everyone.